Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your child? I did. And the night I made that choice, I found out my mother had absolutely no idea what my father had quietly left behind to make sure I'd never have to choose alone. My name is Marisol Reyes. I'm 42 years old, an ICU nurse in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I have spent my whole adult life being the person who stays calm when everyone else falls apart. It's what the job trains into you, and it's what my family has always expected from me at home, too. This is the story of the night everything in my family finally came apart, and the weeks after that put it back together in a shape none of us expected. If this is your first time here, hit like and subscribe. You're not alone, and neither was I. Stay with me, because this one takes a few turns I never saw coming, even after I thought I understood everything that was happening to us. To understand how we ended up on that porch in the rain, you have to go back further, to the last year my father was alive. His name was Ernesto Reyes. He'd spent 38 years as a family doctor in Santa Fe, the kind who still made house calls decades after other physicians had stopped bothering, who knew the names of his patients' grandchildren, who kept a jar of butterscotch candy on his desk that 3 generations of Santa Fe kids remembered fondly into adulthood. He was proud, stubborn, and famously terrible at accepting help, which made the year he spent sick almost unbearable for everyone in the family except, strangely, my daughter, Estrella. Everyone called her Essie. She was 12 that year, quiet in the particular way of a kid who watches more than she talks, and she never once treated her grandfather like he was fragile. She'd come over after school and sit beside his recliner with homework she didn't actually need help with, just for a reason to be near him. He'd pretend to check her math while secretly dozing off mid-sentence, and she'd let him, tucking an old wool blanket over his knees without ever waking him, careful as a nurse herself. That blanket became a project of hers over the months. She found an old sewing kit in my mother's hall closet and started stitching small, crooked stars onto the corners, one at a time, whenever she visited. My father would examine each new star solemnly, like a jeweler appraising a stone, and declare it the finest star he had ever personally witnessed. It became a ritual between them. By the time he passed, there were 11 stars, unevenly spaced, thread ends left a little too long because a 12-year-old hadn't quite learned to trim them close. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital those months, came home, and then drove straight to my parents' house most nights to handle his medications myself. I didn't trust anyone else to get the dosages and timing right, not out of arrogance, but because I'd watched enough medication errors happen to strangers in my own ICU to know how easily a small mistake becomes a permanent one. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. I learned which of his moods meant pain and which meant fear, and that they often looked identical from the doorway. My mother, Dolores, sat with him some evenings an hour here, sometimes 2, and seemed to consider her part of the arrangement complete after that. She'd tell friends at church how hard she was going through this, and I never once corrected her, because correcting her had never once, in 42 years, changed anything about how she saw herself. My sister, Camila, visited on weekends, Sunday afternoons mostly, always arriving after the difficult parts of the morning, the bathing, the medication schedule, the moments where he was frightened and needed someone patient beside him, and always leaving before dinner. Before the evening confusion sometimes set in, she brought store-bought flowers and her 2 kids, who ran through the house loudly enough that my father, exhausted, often slept through most of the visit anyway. I didn't do any of it to be praised. I did it because he was my father, and because some debts you don't calculate, you just pay. But my mother kept score in her own private way that whole year, and somehow, in her version of events that formed slowly and quietly over those months, my constant presence in that house became something to resent rather than something to be grateful for. I understand now that people who feel guilty about giving too little sometimes find it easier to resent the person giving more than to sit with what that says about themselves. When my father passed in the spring of 2024, on a Tuesday morning in April, with the first apricot blossoms just opening on the tree outside his window, the house didn't just lose him, it lost its rhythm entirely. And my mother lost whatever thin patience she'd had left for pretending things between us were fine. Within 2 months, his study of the room, with his medical journals still stacked exactly as he'd left them, his reading glasses still folded on the desk, had become a playroom for Camilla's kids, His recliner, the one Essie used to curl up beside, ended up under a plastic sheet in the garage, just until we figure out what to do with it, which was a sentence that somehow never had a follow-up conversation. Essie and I got moved without much discussion from the guest room we'd always used into the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that used to store off-season clothes, as though grief applied some shrinking effect that only ever touched the two of us. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself grief made people behave strangely, and that things would settle once the first hard months passed. I believed that for longer than I probably should have. Small things kept happening, the kind of things that are almost impossible to explain to someone outside the situation without sounding petty, and that's exactly what makes them so effective. My mother would forget to save Essie a plate at dinner if she ran a little late from volleyball practice, then act surprised, as though it hadn't happened 3 times already that month. Camilla's kids picked the television every single night, and Essie, who'd learned early that asking for a turn only ever led to disappointment, stopped asking entirely and brought her own books instead. Once, in the fall of that first year, I found Essie's science fair model, a working scale model of an acequia irrigation system, something she'd worked on for 3 weeks with real pride sitting crushed at the bottom of the recycling bin because it was taking up counter space. She never mentioned it to me. I only found out weeks later when her teacher gently asked why Essie had seemed so subdued during her follow-up presentation, having apparently improvised something smaller and less impressive at the last minute rather than tell anyone what had happened to the original. I brought it up with my mother carefully, the way you approach something you already suspect will go badly. She waved a hand without even looking up from her phone. "You're too sensitive about that girl. She needs to learn the world doesn't revolve around her." I stood in that kitchen with my hands flat on the counter, trying to work out whether staying silent in that moment was patience or cowardice. I told myself it was patience. I'm no longer sure that's true. Camilla, for her part, never said anything unkind directly. Her method was quieter, a kind of slow, steady repositioning, where she and her husband got their own key to the house within 6 weeks of my father's passing, where family decisions started getting made in a group text I was added to only after the fact, where holiday planning happened around a calendar that somehow never quite lined up with my hospital schedule, as though the possibility of accommodating me had simply stopped occurring to anyone. I noticed all of it. I told myself repeatedly that noticing it and naming it were 2 different things, and that naming it would cost more than I was ready to pay. I was wrong about that for close to 18 months before the porch made the decision for me. 6 days before the night that changed everything, I got a call from Bianca Trujillo, my father's longtime attorney, whose office sat in one of those thick-walled adobe buildings a few blocks off the plaza, the kind with vigas across the ceiling and a cottonwood tree shading the courtyard. "Marisol," she said, "I need you to come in. Nothing urgent sounding on the phone, I promise, but I do need to see you in person." I assumed it was routine probate paperwork, some final administrative loose end from settling my father's affairs. I sat across from her the next afternoon while she slid a thick manila folder across the desk, sealed with a strip of tape along the edge, my name written on it in my father's own unmistakable handwriting. "Your father came to me about 14 months before he passed," Bianca said, "back when he was still entirely himself, sharp, clear, no question about his competency, which we documented carefully at the time, for reasons that will make sense to you shortly. He asked me to hold this until, in his words, the right moment presents itself. You'll know it when it does, and so will she." I sat there holding the folder, some stubborn and hopeful part of me still wanting to believe that one honest conversation with my mother and sister might resolve everything before it came to whatever was inside. I took the folder home that evening. I set it on my dresser. I didn't open it. I want to be honest with you about why. I think some part of me already suspected what might be inside, and opening it felt like admitting that things between my mother and me had reached a place from which there was no quiet way back. I wasn't ready for that yet. 6 days later, I wouldn't have a choice. Rain doesn't fall gently in northern New Mexico in October. It comes down thin and cold off the mountains, the kind that soaks straight through denim within minutes and makes the pinon smoke from every chimney in the neighborhood hang low and sharp in the air. That's the rain that was falling the evening I finished a double shift at the hospital, exhausted in the particular way that settles into your bones after 16 hours on your feet, and drove to pick up Essie from what was supposed to be a 2-hour visit at her grandmother's house. I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in, an old adobe on acequia madre, with a courtyard my father had rebuilt himself, brick by brick, over 2 long summers when I was a teenager, and my headlights swept across the porch to find my 14-year-old daughter curled up on the top step, her backpack pulled over her knees like a shield, soaked completely through. She wasn't crying anymore by the time I reached her. I think she'd already run out of tears an hour or more earlier. "Mom," her voice cracked on the single word. "The key doesn't work. I tried calling you like 6 times, but my phone died, and I didn't want to just walk to a stranger's house, so I waited." My own phone showed 6 missed calls, all logged over roughly the same window, from a battery that had died while sitting locked in my hospital locker, something I only ever did on the very worst nights, when I genuinely couldn't afford a single distraction on the floor. I hadn't known this would be the one night it would matter more than any other night of my life. I tried the front door, new hardware, unfamiliar under my hand. Fresh brass, still shining faintly under the porch light, like it hadn't even had time to weather yet. I knocked once. The door opened, and there was my mother Dolores standing in a cream cardigan, a glass of red wine loose in one hand, warm and dry, and entirely unbothered, while my daughter shivered visibly behind me in a soaked hoodie that had gone from gray to nearly black with rainwater. Past her down the hallway, my sister Camilla leaned against the wall, scrolling her phone, not even looking up, as though this were an entirely unremarkable Tuesday evening. On the coffee table behind them both, folded with a strange, deliberate care that struck me as almost cruel in its precision, sat Essie's quilt, the one with the 11 crooked stars, the one my father had kept over his knees during his last months. "You changed the locks," I said. It wasn't really a question. My mother took a slow, unhurried sip of her wine before answering. "It was time for a fresh start, Marisol. You understand. She sat out here for 4 hours, in the rain. She's fine. Children are resilient. You were resilient at her age too, as I recall, and nobody worried half this much about you." I felt Essie's hand slide into mine from behind. Her fingers were like ice, and something in that small, cold grip did more to steady my next words than any anger could have. My mother lifted her chin slightly, the exact gesture she used to make right before announcing that dinner was ready. The gesture of someone accustomed to being obeyed without further discussion, and said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. "We voted. This isn't your home anymore." I looked past her toward Camilla, half expecting some flicker of discomfort, some sign that at least one person in that house understood what had just happened to a 14-year-old on their front steps. My sister didn't even glance up from her phone. It's better this way, honestly. Less tension in the house for everyone. Less tension. That was the phrase they'd landed on for a 14-year-old girl left outside in the cold for 4 hours because 2 grown women had decided the house would simply run more smoothly with the 2 of us gone. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. Something in me had already gone very quiet and very clear, the way it sometimes does in the ICU in the exact moment a situation stops being manageable through negotiation and starts requiring a decision instead. "Understood," I said. My mother blinked, visibly thrown by how calm I sounded. She clearly braced for tears, or shouting, or the kind of pleading she could use as further proof of my instability. I gave her none of it. I turned, wrapped my arm fully around my daughter's shivering shoulders, and walked her back to the car without another word. In the rearview mirror, the porch light shrank smaller and smaller until the whole house disappeared behind the rain and the dark. We stayed that first night with my coworker, Selena Ortiz, an ER nurse I'd worked alongside for 9 years, who didn't ask a single question when I showed up at her door, past 11 at night with a soaked, silently shaking teenager and 2 hastily packed overnight bags. She simply stepped back to let us in, handed us both towels still warm from the dryer, and started a pot of milk on the stove for hot chocolate before either of us had said a word about what had happened. Essie showered, changed into an old t-shirt of Selena's, and fell asleep on the pull-out couch with her backpack still clutched against her chest, as if she needed to know at least one object in the world couldn't be taken from her overnight while she slept. I sat on the floor beside her until the sky outside the window turned from black to the pale gray that comes right before a Santa Fe sunrise, replaying the porch over and over, trying to locate the exact moment I should have seen this coming, clearly enough to prevent it. I didn't sleep at all that night. I don't think I wanted to. Some part of me needed to sit fully awake inside the anger, rather than let sleep soften it into something more forgivable by morning. I called Bianca first thing. I told her everything in order, trying to keep my voice steady even as my hands weren't. The new locks, the 4 hours in the rain, my mother's wine glass, the quilt folded on the coffee table like something being quietly discarded. There was a long pause on the line, longer than I expected from a woman I'd only ever known to be brisk and efficient. "Marisol," she said finally, her voice sharper than I'd heard it in the 11 years I'd known her. "I need you to bring the folder in today. All of it, unopened if you haven't gotten to it yet. And I need you to not discuss any part of this with your mother or your sister before we talk. Not one word, not even to ask a clarifying question. Can you do that?" I told her I could. I drove straight there after dropping Essie at school, the folder sitting on the passenger seat like something almost alive. Sitting across from Bianca in her courtyard-facing office, I finally opened what my father had left behind 14 months before he passed. Inside was a revised living trust, dated and notarized with unusual care, alongside a certified letter from his own longtime physician, confirming his full mental competency on that exact date, as though he'd somehow anticipated that someone, someday, might try to argue he hadn't known what he was doing. There was a handwritten letter addressed directly to me, in his familiar slanted script, and a separate sealed envelope addressed to my mother, which Bianca had been instructed not to open except under very specific conditions. Bianca walked me through it slowly, patiently, the way you'd explain something enormous to someone still in shock. My father, worried even then a full year before his death about how the family might behave once he was gone, had quietly restructured ownership of the house. It had never simply passed to my mother outright, as everyone in the family had always assumed it eventually would. Instead, he'd placed it into a trust with specific, binding conditions, built deliberately to protect the two people who had spent the most time actually caring for him in those final hard months, me and Estrella. The conditions were direct. The house could never be used to exclude either of us from it. If that condition was ever violated, documented, provable, Bianca, acting as trustee, was legally required to enforce a transfer clause immediately. Full ownership moving to me and Essie, with my mother required to vacate the property within 30 days of formal written notice. "I can't act on suspicion alone, or on your account by itself, painful as it is," Bianca said gently. "I need documented, provable evidence of an actual violation. What you're describing to me, a minor child locked out in the rain for 4 hours, an explicit statement that the home no longer belongs to you, that, if we can document it properly, is more than enough." I sat there holding my father's handwriting in my lap and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something other than exhaustion. I felt seen by a man who wasn't there to see it happen, and who had somehow arranged, over a year in advance, to make sure I wouldn't have to fight this fight without him. Here's something I didn't know yet, sitting in that office. 2 months earlier, my mother had proudly installed a new smart video doorbell on the front entrance, showing it off to half the neighborhood like she'd invented the technology herself, delighted every time it caught a delivery driver or a stray cat crossing the porch. She had never once considered what else it might eventually record. When Bianca's investigator formally requested the footage as part of documenting the violation, the doorbell had captured the entire exchange from that rainy night in crisp, unmistakable audio and video. My mother's voice, clear as anything, no ambiguity to argue away later. "We voted. This isn't your home anymore." Essie visibly shivering on the step below her. The warm, dry lit living room framed perfectly behind my mother in the open doorway, undeniable in its contrast to the cold, dark porch. My mother had built, with her own hands and her own pride, the exact piece of evidence that would eventually undo her entire position. I still think about the particular irony of that some nights that the very technology she'd installed to feel more in control of her home ended up being the thing that took it from her. Further back in the same folder, tucked beneath several pages of trust documentation, was something I genuinely hadn't expected. A fully funded education trust for Estrella, established the very same month he'd revised the family trust, quietly contributed to every single month for over a year, entirely without my knowledge. It covered, in full, 4 years of university tuition, room, and board, at whatever school she eventually chose to attend. He had been protecting her future, methodically and privately, during the exact same months I thought I was the only one still fighting for her in that house. Reading the account statements month after month, small deposits made without fanfare or announcement, I finally understood something about my father I hadn't fully appreciated while he was alive. He did his most important work quietly, and he trusted the results to speak for him eventually, in their own time. As Bianca's process moved forward, a required financial review of the household necessary to fully establish the context surrounding the violation surfaced something else entirely. 2 months before that rainy night, Camila had taken out a private loan from a family friend, using the house informally as collateral in conversations she'd had, based on an assumption that she and my mother would eventually inherit the property outright and could refinance against it later. Locking Essie and me out hadn't only ever been about less tension in the house, as Camila had said so easily on the porch. It had also been, at least in part, about clearing the way for a financial arrangement that required my continued presence in that house to become inconvenient enough that I'd simply stop coming around. Learning that didn't make the porch hurt less. If anything, it clarified something I'd been unwilling to fully accept, that this hadn't been an isolated lapse in judgment. It had been a plan, built quietly over months, the same way my father had quietly built his. When my mother's attorney tried, predictably and immediately, to challenge the trust's validity, arguing my father hadn't been of sound mind, or had been unduly influenced, or simply hadn't understood what he was signing, they ran directly into an obstacle nobody on their side had anticipated. The notary who had witnessed my father's competency letter 14 months before his death turned out to be a woman named Rosa Delgado, now in her 40s, who my father had treated decades earlier as a teenager for a serious illness that had, by her own account, likely saved her life. She remembered him vividly, remembered the appointment in question with striking specificity, and testified willingly, warmly, without a hint of hesitation, to every detail of his clarity and competence that day. There was no crack in that foundation for my mother's attorney to find, no matter how hard they tried to manufacture one. I gave my mother 3 full days after that night to reach out honestly, to ask how Essie was doing, to say something that even gestured toward the 4 hours her granddaughter had spent shivering on cold concrete. Instead, on the 3rd day, she texted me, "Are you being dramatic on purpose? Come get your things properly instead of hiding like this is some kind of scandal." That text was her chance, and she used it to ask me, one more time, to make myself smaller for her comfort. That same afternoon I drove back to the house, this time with Bianca beside me and a single sealed envelope resting on her lap. My mother opened the door, still in that same cream cardigan, clearly expecting to see me alone, primed for another round of the pleading she'd been bracing for since the porch. Instead, she found a woman she didn't recognize, holding an envelope stamped with a law firm's letterhead. Camila appeared behind her almost immediately, phone already raised out of pure habit, filming without quite realizing yet what she was about to capture. "Dolores," Bianca said, her voice level and unhurried, "I have a formal legal notice for you regarding the property trust established by Ernesto Reyes." My mother tore open the envelope right there on the porch, read the first paragraph, and I watched her expression shift in real-time irritation curdling into disbelief, disbelief settling slowly into something pale and genuinely stunned. "This isn't real," she whispered, reading it a second time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. "He wouldn't have done this without telling me. 31 years of marriage, and he wouldn't have." "It's very real," Bianca said, not unkindly, but without softening a single word of it either. "The trust was established 14 months before he passed. Every clause is enforceable. Every signature was properly witnessed and independently notarized. And that notarization has already been confirmed under oath. The exclusion of a minor beneficiary from this property constitutes a documented, time-stamped violation of the trust's conditions. Your own doorbell recorded it clearly. This notice formally triggers the transfer clause, effective immediately." My mother looked at me the way you look at someone you suddenly realize you never fully understood. "You planned this," she said. "All of this. You've been planning this the entire time." "No," I said, and I meant it completely. "Dad planned this. I only waited until I didn't have a choice left." My mother tried calling twice during those 30 days, both voicemails. When I finally worked up the willingness to listen to them, turned out to be more about her own humiliation in front of her book club and her church friends than about the hours her granddaughter had spent shivering on a porch. Camila sent one long defensive text accusing me of tearing the family apart over one misunderstanding. Then a second one, days later, that read only, "I hope you're happy." I didn't respond to either message. Some silences say everything more clearly than any reply could. I used those 30 days differently than I expected to. I took Essie to look at colleges 2 states over, something we'd never had the breathing room to do properly before. I repainted the small bedroom we'd been sharing at Selena's, just to give the space some sense of permanence while we waited. I slept some nights, better than I had in over a year, simply because the constant low hum of managing my mother's moods had finally gone quiet. On the 30th day, I stood in that same driveway again, this time with a small rented moving truck idling behind me instead of a soaked, shivering child. Essie walked up the porch steps first, pulled a newly cut key from her jacket pocket, and pushed it into the lock without a moment's hesitation, as though some part of her had needed to prove to herself that it would actually turn. It turned smoothly. The door opened easily under her own hand, for the first time in a month exactly as it should have. She stood in the doorway a second longer than necessary, like she needed to confirm the moment was real before stepping through it. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a small framed photograph of her grandfather, one she'd quietly rescued from a box in Selena's closet weeks earlier, without ever mentioning it to me, and walked it down the hallway, setting it back exactly where it used to hang, adjusting the frame twice until it sat perfectly level. "There," she said softly, mostly to herself. "Now it looks right again." Some people believe love means tolerating anything, staying quiet, keeping the peace, absorbing whatever comes, even when the peace was never actually fair to begin with. I believed that too, for a long time, right up until the night I watched my own daughter shiver on a porch, because 2 grown women had decided her comfort was simply optional to their evening. My father spent the last clear year of his life quietly making sure that decision would eventually cost them everything they assumed was already theirs. I spent 3 careful, difficult days making sure his intentions finally reached the people who most needed to hear them, whether they wanted to or not. That evening, once most of the boxes were unpacked and the house had gone quiet around us, I found Essie asleep on the living room couch with her grandfather's quilt pulled up to her chin, the same 11 crooked stars, the same 2 long thread ends, not clutching her backpack like a shield for the first time in weeks. I sat beside her for a long while in the dark, listening to the old adobe walls finally settle into something that felt entirely like ours again, in every sense that actually mattered, not just on paper. If you were standing on that porch with me, in the rain, would you have said "understood" and walked away quietly, or would you have said something else entirely? Tell me what you would have done, down in the comments. I read every one.